The Carnation Revolution, also referred to as the 25th of April, was initially a military coup in Lisbon, Portugal, on the 25th of April 1974, which overthrew the regime of the Estado Novo. The revolution started as a military coup organized by the armed forces movement composed of military officers who opposed the regime. But the movement was soon coupled with an unanticipated and popular campaign of civil resistance. This movement would lead to the fall of the Estado Novo and the withdrawal of Portugal from its African colonies and East Timor. The name, Carnation Revolution, comes from the fact that almost no shots were fired, and when the population took to the streets to celebrate the end of the dictatorship and war in the colonies, carnations were put into the muzzles of rifles and on the uniforms of the army men. In Portugal, the 25th of April is a national holiday, known as Freedom Day, to celebrate the event. Overview. Portugal had been run by an authoritarian dictatorship, which has frequently been called fascist, for over 4 decades. These events effectively changed the government into a democracy, and produced enormous social, economic, territorial, demographic, and political changes in the country. After 2 years of a transitional period known as PREC, characterized by social turmoil and power disputes between left and right-wing political forces, despite repeated appeals from the revolutionaries on the radio asking the population to stay home, thousands of Portuguese descended on the streets, mixing with the military insurgents. The military-led coup returned democracy to Portugal, ending the unpopular colonial war in which thousands of Portuguese citizens had been conscripted into military service, and replacing the Estado Novo regime and its secret police, which repressed elemental civil liberties and political freedoms. It started as a professional class protest of Portuguese armed forces captains against a decree law, the Declaração 353/73 of 1973. A group of Portuguese low-ranking officers organized in the armed forces movement, including elements who had been fighting the pro-independence guerrillas in the Portuguese Empire's territories in Africa, rose to overthrow the Estado Novo regime that had ruled Portugal since the 1930s. Portugal's new regime pledged itself to end the colonial wars and began negotiations with the African independence movements. By the end of 1974, Portuguese troops had been withdrawn from Portuguese Guinea and the latter had become a UN member state. This was followed by the independence of Cape Verde, Mozambique, São Tomé and Príncipe and Angola in 1975. The Carnation Revolution in Portugal also led to Portugal's withdrawal from East Timor in Southeast Asia. These events prompted a mass exodus of Portuguese citizens from Portugal's African territories, creating over 1 million Portuguese refugees, the Retornados. Although the regime's political police, PIDE, killed 4 people before surrendering, the revolution was unusual in that the revolutionaries did not use direct violence to achieve their goals. Holding red carnations, many people joined revolutionary soldiers on the streets of Lisbon, in apparent joy and audible euphoria. Red is a symbolic color for socialism and communism, which were the main ideological tendencies of many anti-new state insurgents. It was the end of the Estado Novo, the longest-lived authoritarian regime in Western Europe, and the final dissolution of the Portuguese Empire. In the aftermath of the revolution, a new constitution was drafted, censorship was formally prohibited, free speech declared, political prisoners were released, and the Portuguese overseas territories in sub-Saharan Africa were immediately given their independence. East Timor was also offered independence, being invaded by neighboring Indonesia afterwards. Context. At the beginning of the 1970s, the authoritarian regime of the Estado Novo continued to weigh heavily on the country. After a half-century of rule under the President of the Council of Ministers António de Oliveira Salazar, after the 28th of May 1926 coup d'état, Portugal implemented an authoritarian regime of social Catholic and integralist inspiration. In 1933, the regime was recast and renamed Estado Novo, and Salazar was named as President of the Council of Ministers until 1968. When he suffered a stroke following a domestic accident, he was replaced in September by Marcelo Caetano, who served as President of the Council of Ministers until he was deposed on 25 April 1974. Under the Estado Novo, Portugal's undemocratic government was tolerated by its NATO partners due to its anti-communist stance. This attitude changed dramatically during the mid-1960s. Under pressure of public opinion and left-wing movements rising in Europe, there were formal elections, but they were rarely contested, with the opposition using the limited political freedoms allowed during the brief election period to openly protest against the regime, withdrawing their candidates before the election so as not to provide the regime with any legitimacy. In 1958, General Humberto Delgado, a former member of the regime, stood against the regime's presidential candidate, Américo Tomás, and refused to allow his name to be withdrawn from the competition. Tomás won the election, but only amidst claims of widespread electoral fraud that denied Delgado of his legitimate victory. Immediately after this election, Salazar's government abandoned the practice of popularly electing the president, with that task being given thereafter to the regime-loyal National Assembly. During Caetano's time in office, his attempts at minor political reform were obstructed by the important Salazarist elements within the regime. The Estado Novo's political police, the PIDE, later to become DGS, and originally the PVDE, persecuted opponents of the regime, who were often tortured, imprisoned or killed. The international context was not favorable to the Portuguese regime. The Cold War was near its peak, and both Western and Eastern Bloc states were supporting the guerrillas in the Portuguese colonies, attempting to bring these under, respectively, American and Soviet influence. The overseas policy of the Portuguese government and the desire of many colonial residents to remain under Portuguese rule would lead to an abrupt decolonization, which occurred only after the Carnation Revolution of April 1974 and the fall of the regime. Unlike other European colonial powers, Portugal had long-standing and close ties to its African colonies. For the Portuguese ruling regime, the overseas empire was a matter of national interest. In the view of many Portuguese, a colonial empire was necessary for continued national power and influence. In contrast to Britain and France, Portuguese colonial settlers had extensively intermarried and assimilated within the colonies over a period of 400 years. Despite objections in world forums such as the United Nations, Portugal had long maintained that its African colonies were an integral part of Portugal, and felt obliged to militarily defend them against communist-inspired armed groups, particularly after India's annexation of Portuguese exclaves Goa, Daman and Diu in 1961. Independence movements in Portugal's African possessions. Independence movements started operations in the African colonies of Portuguese Mozambique, Portuguese Angola, and Portuguese Guinea. The various conflicts forced the Salazar and subsequent Caetano regimes to spend more of the country's budget on colonial administration and military expenditures, and Portugal soon found itself increasingly isolated from the rest of the world. Throughout the war period, Portugal faced increasing dissent, arms embargoes and other punitive sanctions imposed by most of the international community. For Portuguese society, the war was becoming even more unpopular due to its length and financial costs, the worsening of diplomatic relations with other United Nations members, and the role it had always played as a factor of perpetuation of the Estado Novo regime. It was this escalation that would lead directly to the mutiny of members of the FAP in the Carnation Revolution in 1974, an event that would lead to the independence of the former Portuguese colonies in Africa. Atrocities, such as that at Warayamu in Mozambique, undermined the war's popularity and the government's diplomatic position. Although some details of the Warayamu case remain disputed, many left-wing students and anti-war activists were forced to leave the country so they could escape conscription, imprisonment and torture by government forces. However, between 1945 and 1974, there were also 3 generations of militants of the radical right at the Portuguese universities and schools, guided by a revolutionary nationalism partly influenced by the political subculture of European neo-fascism. The core of these radical students' struggle lay in an uncompromising defense of the Portuguese Empire in the days of the authoritarian regime. Economic conditions. The economy of Portugal and its colonies on the eve of the Carnation Revolution was growing well above the European average. Average family purchasing power was rising together with new consumption patterns and trends, and this was promoting both investment in new capital, equipment and consumption expenditure for durable and non-durable consumer goods. The Estado Novo regime economic policy encouraged and created conditions for the formation of large business conglomerates. The regime maintained a policy of corporatism that resulted in the placement of a big part of the Portuguese economy in the hands of a number of strong conglomerates, including those founded by the families of Antonio Champali Maud, José Manuel de Melo, Américo Amorim and the Dos Santos family. Those Portuguese conglomerates had a business model with similarities to South Korean chaebols and Japanese Kiratsys and Zibasush. The company União Fabril was one of the largest and most diversified Portuguese conglomerates, with its core businesses and corporate headquarters located in mainland Portugal, but also with branches, plants and several developing business projects all around the Portuguese Empire, especially in the Portuguese territories of Angola and Mozambique. Other medium-sized family companies specialized in textiles, ceramics, porcelain, glass and crystal, engineered wood, canned fish, fishing, food and beverages, tourism and in agriculture completed the panorama of the national economy by the early 1970s. In addition, rural areas' populations were committed to agrarianism that was of great importance for a majority of the total population, with many families living exclusively from agriculture or complementing their salaries with farming, husbandry and forestry yields. Besides that, the colonies were also displaying impressive economic growth and development rates from the 1920s onwards. Even during the Portuguese colonial war, a counterinsurgency war against independentist guerrilla and terrorism, Portuguese Angola and Portuguese Mozambique had continuous economic growth rates and several sectors of its local economies were booming. They were internationally notable centers of production of oil, coffee, cotton, cashew, coconut, timber, minerals, metals, banana, citrus, tea, sisal, beer, cement, fish and other sea products, beef and textiles. Tourism was also a fast-developing activity in Portuguese Africa, both by the growing development of and demand for beach resorts and wildlife reserves. Labor unions were not allowed and a minimum wage policy was not enforced. However, in a context of an expanding economy, bringing better living conditions for the Portuguese population in the 1960s, the outbreak of the colonial wars in Africa set off significant social changes, among them the rapid incorporation of more and more women into the labor market. Marcelo Caetano moved on to foster economic growth and some social improvements, such as the awarding of a monthly pension to rural workers who had never had the chance to pay Social Security. The objectives of Caetano's pension reform were threefold: enhancing equity, reducing fiscal and actuarial imbalance, and achieving more efficiency for the economy as a whole, for example, by establishing contributions which distorted labor markets less, or by allowing the savings generated by pension funds to increase the investments in the economy. After Salazar's stroke in 1968, Caetano had taken over the office of Prime Minister. His main slogan was "evolution in continuity," suggesting that there would be a reform of the Salazarist system. His so-called political spring included greater political tolerance and freedom of the press, and was regarded as an opportunity by the opposition to gain concessions from the regime. In 1969, the Estado Novo-controlled nation got indeed a very slight taste of democracy, and Caetano allowed the establishment of the first democratic labor union movement since the 1920s. Nevertheless, after the elections of 1969 and 1973, it was clear that the past practices of political repression would continue against communists, anti-colonialists and other oppositionists. In 1973, Caetano was pressured by the ultra-right faction inside the Salazarist elite to abandon his reform experiment. By the early 1970s, the Portuguese colonial war continued to rage on, requiring a steadily increasing budget. The Portuguese military was overstretched and there was no political solution or end in sight. While the human losses were relatively small, the war as whole had already entered its second decade. The Portuguese ruling regime of Estado Novo faced criticism from the international community and was becoming increasingly isolated. The colonial war had a profound impact on Portugal. Thousands of young men avoided conscription by emigrating illegally, mainly to France and the US. In addition, the other revolutionary armed forces movement's goals were not in the strict interest of the people of Portugal or its colonies, since the movement was initiated not only as an attempt to liberate Portugal from the authoritarian Estado Novo regime, but as an attempt of rebellion against the new military laws that were to be presented next year. The revolution and the whole movement were also a way to work against laws that would reduce military costs and would reformulate the whole Portuguese military branch. Younger military academy graduates resented a program introduced by Marcelo Caetano whereby militia officers who completed a brief training program, and had served in the colony's defensive campaigns, could be commissioned at the same rank as military academy graduates. As the war in the colonies was becoming increasingly unpopular in Portugal itself, with the people becoming weary of war and balking at its ever-rising expense, the military insurgents took advantage of it and got some momentum. Many ethnic Portuguese of the African colonies were also increasingly willing to accept independence if their economic status could be preserved. Following the coup d'état in Portugal in 1974, the new left-wing revolutionary government of Portugal began to negotiate with the African pro-independence guerrillas. The new government in Lisbon was disinclined to prop up Portugal's convulsing and by now very expensive empire. All the Portuguese territories in Africa were rapidly granted their independence.